In the United States, most people are familiar with the two most common types of land, public land and private land. Public land can be used by everyone. It's public. Private land, on the other hand, is, well, private. But what about a third type of land? Something that lives kind of in the middle. Not really totally public, but also not really private. In this video, I'm going to share with you my very limited knowledge about Idaho state land, and more importantly, how I believe and my perspective on why I think it's created some of the absolute coolest dirt bike trails known to man. See, Idaho was granted statehood in 1890, and as was common for newly born states at the time, the government would issue a portion of land to the state. It's called state-issued trust land. Now, I'm definitely not an expert when it comes to all the legal stuff and the rich history about how it all came about, the land exchanges and all that stuff. But I have learned enough to at least share my perspective and why, if you ride dirt bikes, it kind of matters. Now, the idea is simple. The United States is a vast landscape full of natural resources: lumber, water, farmland, oil, and all that jazz, particularly the western United States. The intention of state-issued trust land was to dedicate a portion of each state's land to the purpose of utilizing the natural resources to generate income that could then be used for schools or the education system. Whether riding dirt bikes on it actually fits into that, I don't really know, but we're just gonna say yes. Now, it's actually quite fascinating how state land is issued. The government big shots did it through a process called townships, 6 mile by 6 mile squares that could each be divided up into 36 smaller 1 mile by 1 mile squares. Square number 16 and 36 would be given to the state. The other 34 squares could be sold to private owners or whatever. Now, in theory, when this went into effect, you would apply this checkerboard across the entire state, the state taking their 2 squares and moving on to the next township. However, it didn't exactly work this way. Idaho and many other states in the western US have very rugged areas, steep mountains, deep forests, and other terrain that is nearly uninhabitable. These areas often fell under the Forest Reserve Act. If a township's sections 16 and 36 fell inside an already dedicated piece of Forest Service, Idaho would not be able to claim it as state land. Now, what does any of this have to do with motorcycles? Well, at the time all of this transpired over 150 years ago, nobody was really concerned about making the land conducive for motorcycle race courses, let alone a race as infamous as the Idaho City 100. A patchwork of ownership types, state trust land, U.S. Forest Service, and private ground all got stitched together by accident of history. How does riding even happen here? The answer lies in relationships between riders, landowners, and the state. But those relationships had to be built on something older. The land itself had already been shaped by the people who came before, which is why, to understand the race, specifically the Idaho City 100, you first have to understand what was done to this land. Therefore, the story of the Idaho City 100 really begins before any set of tires ever laid a track. In the 1860s and 70s, Idaho City was one of the largest cities in the Pacific Northwest, bigger than Portland, and driven by a gold rush. Prospectors at the time used a variety of different methods to find gold. Some of the more successful methods included loosening the soil of the drainages and streams. Many of Idaho's major drainages were mined with dredges. However, before the dredge ever came along, early prospectors used high-pressure water to blast away at the hillside. These large cannons required water at very strategic points in the mountain. To transport the water to different locations in the mountains, workers built a strategic series of ditches and flumes to direct the water. Despite Idaho City's boom, the gold rush didn't last forever. Once the mines played out, the miners left, and most of Idaho City's population vanished. The ditches and water systems were abandoned in place. What do you do with 150 years of forgotten infrastructure that's carved into the mountain terrain? You ride dirt bikes on it, of course. Many of those old waterways cut into the side of mountains and graded for consistent slope turned out to be natural trail corridors. The miners had unknowingly done the hardest part of trail work a century in advance. This caused the terrain around Idaho City to become something genuinely rare, rideable ground that felt both wild and intentional. Word spread, and eventually someone had the idea to make it a race. Dick Rockroar, alongside the original members of the Boise Ridge Riders, banded together and formed an enduro event, and in 1984, the Idaho City 100 was born. A long-distance off-road race threading through the mountains surrounding the original gold mining town of Idaho City, using those old ditch corridors as part of the course. Over time, it became one of the most respected events in the western United States. The challenge is a race that crosses multiple land types with multiple owners isn't just a ride, it's a diplomatic operation. Any of those landowners could say no. Any change in ownership could kill the course. The whole thing runs on good faith and handshakes. For years, it worked. Private landowners gave access because they respected the community and the sport. The state trust land provided a stable anchor. The Forest Service added connective roads and routes. I remember a particular experience in 2010, racing on a very challenging route north of Idaho City. It was exceptionally muddy that year, and the trails were very difficult. I didn't know it at the time, but much of the terrain used for that course was on private land owned by the Boise Cascade Logging Company. This section of the forest played an imperative role in building the routes for the events north of Idaho City. For years, they had granted the Boise Ridge Riders Motorcycle Club their blessing to use the land for the event. Another one of my favorite experiences occurred in 2015, the very first time I actually won the Idaho City 100. The route that year again utilized many miles of trail that navigated through the private land of the Cascade Logging Company. The race existed because people chose to let it exist. This meant that the race's survival was always contingent, and therefore when the largest piece of that puzzle, the largest private landowner, sold, everything changed. By this point, you're probably starting to get a sense of my passion for maps and exploring, and I feel like it's a fitting time to introduce our new sponsor. OnX Off-Road has partnered with Ride with the Knights, and I honestly could not be more excited to collaborate with them. I absolutely love maps. My wife teases me because at night when I lay in bed, I can sit there and read a map like it's a book. I like to plan routes before I ride, use maps while I'm out riding, and study the routes after I get back. OnX Off-Road offers all of the tools to explore and get the most from your riding experience. My favorite feature is the ability to download map layers for offline use. This allows me to navigate and see all of the interesting details even when I'm deep in the mountains. I'm also really excited to try out their new buddy tracking feature. The best part is you can save on either a premium or elite membership by using code RWTK20. Scan the QR code on the screen or click the link below to save 20% on your subscription and get started today. In 2016, the Boise Cascade Logging Company sold more than 10,000 acres of private timberland in the Idaho City area to DF Development. The land had been quietly, reliably open to the Boise Ridge Riders Motorcycle Club for generations. With the sale, the gates were locked and the access disappeared. This wasn't just a race problem. It was a gut punch to an entire community that had built its identity, its summers, its friendships, its memories around this terrain. Years of pristine single-track trails that had been maintained and archived in the mountains were now lost. A place that I loved so much was suddenly gone. I never knew if I would be able to ride there again. I felt it. I had raced there, dreamed there, driven hours and waited each year to go back there. Some of the most vivid motorcycle experiences I have had occurred there. The loss wasn't really just abstract, it was specific. The trails didn't just disappear physically. They were still there, back in those mountains. I remember many times staring out into the distance, looking at those rolling green forests and just imagining what it would be like to ride those trails one last time. I knew out there somewhere there sat a small dark single track, waiting quietly in the forest. The race still went on. The Boise Ridge Riders Motorcycle Club had to rely heavily on a lot of the Forest Service routes and roads to make the courses work and connect things the way they wanted. And they also just used a lot of their old courses that were in other areas. But everyone still knew The most pristine trails were still there. The course that had defined my early racing career was on hold, or maybe gone for good. What do you do when a place that shaped you gets taken away? How do you hold on to something you can't control? And is it naive to hope that those trails, once sold to developers, would ever really come back? Years went by and the event still happened. Quietly behind the scenes, the Boise Ridge Riders Motorcycle Club began discussions. 2025 rolls around, a full decade since any motorized competition had occurred on this piece of property. The club had negotiated access and had a new agreement. DF Development had granted 2-year permission to the club. The last 2 years, I have had the privilege and gift of riding and racing my motorcycle on this exact piece of property, this land that I hadn't seen in over 10 years. It truly was a full circle moment. Despite the conditions not necessarily being ideal with dust both years, it still was one of my most memorable riding experiences. You might be asking, what's so different about this area compared to the surrounding areas? And it's really hard to say. It may be the smoother trails, or maybe the fact that it is such a special privilege to ride there. Honestly, for me personally, the biggest reason has to do with the memories that built me as a young rider. So many experiences I had to go through as a young rider to forge me into the person I am today occurred on these trails. It's a little bit different now. The fulfillment and riding joy is still there, but the Idaho City riding community as a whole knows something that it didn't before. It's fragile. The access is a gift, extended by people who don't have to give it. Riding those old ditch grades, looking out over the vast mountains where miners once worked, you start thinking about what it means to belong to a place, or for a place to belong to a community. The Idaho Trust Land System was designed to fund schools. The miners were chasing gold. Nobody was thinking about dirt bikes. And yet, here we are. We build our lives and our passions on land that was shaped by people who had no idea we were coming. What do we owe them? What do we owe the people who come after us? And what responsibility does a riding community have to the terrain it depends on? The answer isn't a policy position, it's a practice. It's showing up to clean trails. It's thanking the landowner. It's knowing the history, the gold rush, the ditches, the checkerboard map, so you ride with some understanding of where you actually are. The Idaho City 100 is still running. The course still threads through state land, Forest Service ground, and private land held by people who choose every year to say yes. The old ditch grades are still there, cut into the mountain by men who died long before you and I were born. You can't guarantee this lasts. Another sale, another development deal, another stranger's name on a deed, and it could be gone away. How do you love something you can't protect? You love it anyways. You ride it with intention. You tell the story, the whole story, including the loss, so that other people understand what they're riding through, not just where they're riding. The Idaho City 100 isn't just a race. It's a relationship between a community and a landscape that has to be renewed every single year. And as long as people are willing to do that work, the gates stay open. If you are watching this video and you were one of the riders that participated in either the 2025 or 2026 Idaho City 100 event, you rode your motorcycle on DF development land, and chances are you probably had a smile on your face as you were doing so. Scott Trosper from the Boise Ridge Riders Motorcycle Club has extended a kind invitation to all of us as riders to mail a handwritten letter to the owners of DF Development, thanking them for their gift of allowing us to ride our motorcycles there. You can see the address below.